Bom dia. That's the most Portuguese you're going to hear from me this morning. So for those of you with the headsets, if you would go ahead and put those on. At the outset, I would tell you that even though the title of the presentation is Consumer Pattern Analysis in the Retail Supply Chain and Merchandising Functions, this presentation is really all about understanding the consumer as a retailer and how you can work better to make more profit understanding them. That said, there was a book written quite a while ago that basically the title of it was The Line of the Ancient Mariner, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. His comment was water everywhere and not a drop to drink. Obviously describing, a sailor at sea with nothing he could drink, but surrounded by it. If you think about it, retailers are very similar to this situation. You're surrounded by something that is not so useful to you. It's data, it's information. You have lots and lots of information, lots and lots of data, but very few insights that you can get out of it on a day-to-day basis. In order for that data to be useful, you need to understand the underlying patterns. Traditional techniques that you have seen that have been around for 30, 40, 50 years describe just the very basic patterns that are inside of your information. New technology has come out that exists, which uses a lot more machine language, predictive analytics, and ways to understand information to give you insight to how the consumer is thinking and what you need to do about it. Today, what I'm hoping to do is to give you a little bit of background about how you could look at your information. Everyone seems to think, oh no, I have poor information or I don't have enough. And I'm here to tell you that you probably have more than enough information to dig a little deeper to understand the consumer. I'm going to talk about a few techniques, and hopefully we can discuss at coffee a little bit more if you'd like to understand how some of this works. If you look at kind of the topics for today, first I'm going to talk a little about these consumer patterns, trying to understand how the consumer thinks. Second, the more difficult ones. I'm going to give you two examples, a little bit of a case study to explain how these examples work, how the algorithms work, how you can apply them at retail, and how you can actually use them to improve your profits as you go through. There are other models, many of them. I'm going to give you just a very brief discussion of some different ways with big data and lots of information that you can analyze it, and a little bit of caution. What is nice about many of these systems and techniques is smaller retailers can actually advance past very large retailers when using these techniques. But there are some pitfalls, there are some challenges that you need to be aware of. And last, a little bit of a roadmap of how you could go about using some of these techniques. Anybody who has seen retail data has seen the top line, top to the left pattern. It's very noisy. It goes all over the place. Typically, the first thing most people do when they try and understand and analyze their information, down to the by item, by store, whether it's online or whether it's in a retail establishment, is they try to explain the simplest patterns first. And what you're looking for typically in this is, what happens if I increase or decrease price to that pattern? What happens when I do certain promotions to that pattern? They try and look at products, fashion or otherwise, that have seasonality, where they have a start and a stop to their season. And then also they want to look at, if they can, substitutability, what you would call demand transference. If I have one item here and one item here, are people willing to trade one for the other if I don't have one of those items? Demand transference is particularly important, but it's hard to arrive at. Ultimately, what people try to get to today, if you think of it, is that blue line. It's understanding baseline demand. What's going on with the consumer? What are these things that they have to influence what they are doing? Now, all of that said, anybody who's looked at forecasting algorithms and methodologies that people have used for years, they have the bottom part, this green erratic line. It's what remains. People call it humorously error or variation. The reality is, it's just what's unexplained. This is where the real patterns lie in terms of understanding the consumer. You've explained easy things, but if you can look at the patterns underneath with the data, and with today's tools and technologies, you can. You have the information, the computers are powerful enough, and the algorithms are available that you can actually explain what goes on in that last part, which is unexplained. Those retailers that are doing it are making huge profits relative to the same retailers in the same categories that don't use some of these techniques. I'm going to give you two main examples. There's not enough time today to take you through a lot more. I'll tell you the stories behind the examples, and then a little bit about what you find with the data, and most importantly, once you understand the pattern, what to do with it at retail, because it's interesting to look at retail information and find out a story, but you have to do something with that story at retail in order to make incremental profit. The first one we're going to go through is something that internally we call multi-unit sales, which is sales correlation to in-stock position. That's a lot of words. What it means is the following. Every retailer has some items which sell in multiple units or in combination with each other. An example would be if you went out to shop for dinner plates, you're not going to buy just one. You're going to buy some number. You may buy 6, 12. For those of you with big families, you're going to buy 18, 24, whatever it takes. If you only have one in stock, that's not enough. You have to have more. The second thing that correlates to kind of this algorithm and way of thinking of things is things in combination. If it were jewelry, and I was going out to buy jewelry, and the earrings existed, but let's just say the bracelet and the necklace to match the earrings didn't exist in the same location, I might lose a sale because I did not have all three of those, or at least my wife wouldn't be very happy at a bare minimum. So that's the first concept we're going to talk about, is understanding this idea of multi-unit sales, how things work together in consumer thinking. The second one that I'm going to go through is a little bit more oriented toward assortment and assortment optimization. This concept is that there are demand patterns that exist below the data in the item attributes. If you basically take all of the things that are sold, pull them apart to, let's just call their smaller concept, which is what is the attribute. For those of you who are into category management, particularly the Catman2, the more advanced thinking that exists today, it's the question of what is the customer decision tree? What does the customer think about when they walk in to buy this item? Do they first think about price? Do they first think about flavor? What are the types of things that they think about? These are the attributes that we want to pull apart and understand. So I'm going to take you through an example of that as the second one, and talk about how you can use some of that information. And last, which is somewhat in combination with the one before, if you have the data at an attribute level, you can start to understand demand transference, halo and cannibalization. If I have two items exactly the same, and I remove one, I may end up with very little loss of sales. However, there are certain categories where that is not true. The customer perceives a difference, so will they look very similar, and you will lose demand. It's important to understand how much demand you are losing and where you are losing it to in order to optimize your assortment, or else you're going to end up with, as many people say, the long tail, many items, and many of them don't sell in the far end. Demand transference as it goes through. So, with that as kind of an understanding and a base to start with, let's look at those examples with real data, and I'll talk about how it actually works. The key underneath this is trying to understand, quote unquote, the system. The system is a question of how does the consumer think about this category? The one we're talking about is automobile tires. Could be any category. This is live data, this is a live example. I chose this one because it's a little bit easier to understand. We had some from Crate and Barrel as an example with the dinnerware, with the plates and so forth. But this one is much easier to understand. As you run through all of the data and the information, the machine analyzes and says, where am I seeing correlation? Where am I seeing two things happening that seem to respond and relate to each other? One of the things that the machine found when it was running through the automotive tire information was that when you had different amounts in stock at a store, there were very different demand patterns. When you think it through, the underlying system, the system is a car. The car is how the consumer thinks of it. There are 4 tires. A customer, when they buy, they're going to buy 4 tires, or 2 tires, or 1 tire. It's just the way we operate. It's the way we think about a car and how we do it. But the way that the existing in stock at a retailer worked was, it was considered in stock as long as there was 1 tire. So, not right when you think about it. The second part of now understanding there's a correlation between how many are there and the sales. The second thing you want to understand is, okay, how much do I lose if I have less than 4? The data up above shows you exactly what happens. When there are 4 tires and you remove 1, you go down to 3, you lose 44% of your demand. 44% of the people wanted all 4. 3, not enough. What happens? Several things. They will either go to another retailer, or they will trade either up or down in price, but they will move in some way. And I chose the second example that I'll show you in a minute, particularly because of this, because it answers some of those next set of questions. So if you look at it, and now you try and decide, what would I do any differently? Well, what you need to do is, you need to change your forecasting and your profitability models as you look at them. The true demand, as it looks through, was actually roughly 40 to 50% higher than what the retailer thought. Why? Because they were not always stocking in 4. They were stocking 2s, 3s, and so forth. Missing that demand, their sales showed a pattern, and they thought that that was the truth, and it was not. They needed more. Then we shifted the strategy. The best place for understanding this algorithm and how it works is replenishment. Replenishment then kicked in, and the algorithm now says, hey, look, for this particular product, in stock is 4 at a bare minimum for any of these things, and here's how you will lose as you go down between the different items. That said, it was not universal. There were certain store locations that 2 tires was just fine. People did not tend to. It was not a particularly affluent area, so they chose instead to go and say 2 tires is fine, I'm not going to replace all 4. But understanding that, all of a sudden you have the capability to increase customer satisfaction and decrease the amount of business that went to a competitor just by understanding that underlying pattern. So here's the trick. Number 1, find the pattern. What is the pattern for this individual category? In this case, obviously, customer purchase is influenced by the amount of stock. Second, we have to go one level deeper. We have to understand and create an algorithm. The model on this, according to that demand, explains the stock pattern. If the item in stock is less than 4, demand decreases by 44%. If it's less than 2, I lose 72% of my overall demand for each of these items. And so you can now understand what's going on, you can apply it, you can look back in time and see what actually happened according to the models. You monitor it, and then you change it as time goes on. So this improvement alone, for that category, improved sales by anywhere from 30 to 40%, and improved profitability within that category, roughly 3 to 8%. Very simple to think through, one model as it goes through. What are the learnings? If you said key, number one, true demand is not being forecast accurately. Traditional mechanisms of how you forecast demand were incorrect. Second is the average sales increase was over 40% before and after the model. Next, which is always important, customer satisfaction was improved. They found the item that they wanted. They didn't have to trade to another brand or trade in quality of tire. Add-on sales increased. Why? Once the customer came in, found exactly what they wanted in the amount that they wanted, they then looked around for other things that they added on to the sale. So it improved incremental sales. The other thing that it shows you, for those of you in category management and out of stocks and trying to measure it, what it basically says is the traditional out of stock measurement is flawed. It's incorrect. For that category, less than 1 traditionally was considered out of stock. Obviously, there is an incremental out of stock somewhere when you're in 3 and 2 and 1 as well. So the new measurement allows you to improve what you're doing. And last is application of the model. Methodology applies to products that sell in multiples or in combination. So as I said before, if you're a retailer and you are a jewelry retailer and you see that you have the earrings and the necklace and the bracelet that all match, you want to analyze what happens with one of those go out of stock, what happens to the sales of the other 2, how do you measure true demand as you go inside of each of these. So the model would almost guarantee for all the retailers in the room, you have 1 or more products in what you sell that this applies to. It's either multi-unit or it's things in combination that these models can actually measure, and then you apply the technique. Next example I want to walk through is a bit more complicated, but hopefully I can explain it to you. I should back up and tell you all of our algorithms and data science and math comes from not just our data science people, but from 2 professors, Dr. Fisher, who's with the Wharton School of Business, and Dr. Raman, who is with the Harvard Business School. Both of those gentlemen have a lot of white papers. They're written up quite a bit in Harvard Business Reviews. They actually are the founders of our company. But I will tell you, I am not a detailed math statistician. I understand how it works. So if you want to ask me detailed questions later, I'm probably going to have to give you the email of Dr. Fisher. But let's tell you a little bit about more about this idea. Powerful concept. There are attribute demand patterns inside of all of your data. Now, if you look at any category, up at the upper right, we've got a category which is snack kits. Every category, every item has a couple of different attributes which are key and important. In this one, it happens to be the brand, the flavor, and the size are the customer's main way of thinking about whether or not they want to purchase each of these areas. That said, what's also curious and interesting is when we worked with the buyers for this particular product, they had a very specific view. Their view was that the customer first selected brand, then they selected flavor, then they selected size. Makes logical sense that that's the way they thought of it. We go through sales history and match up the math and the algorithm to see if that correlation is correct. Humorously and interestingly, we found out that when you did that analysis in convenience stores, as opposed to a grocery store, or if this was also sold in pharmacies and some other areas. But in particular, in grocery, it had a certain pattern. In convenience, the number one thing was size. The customer cared whether it was a multi-pack or a single pack was the first thing they thought of. They didn't care about the brand. They didn't care about the flavor. They were going in there for a specific purpose, whether it was just for them or they were getting something for a group of them as it went through. So the key point that I want to make here is that just because you have a customer decision tree you think applies on these attributes, many times when you run through data, it changes by the type of area, the type of retail that you're in, et cetera. But that's the key concept, number one. Take apart each of these items down to its attributes and what are the important consumer decision tree attributes. The attribute levels at each of these things can then be used to estimate demand. In essence, it's think of taking sales, and rather than just doing it at a unit level, you're now diving one level deeper. You're saying things like, what are my sales by flavor across all? What are my sales by size in a certain package size, et cetera, and de-aggregating all of the information at that level. You now have a technique, believe it or not, to use against substitution, what item goes against another one, and you can also calculate and optimize profitability for the assortment based upon the items that are in there before you change the assortment. In other words, you can run the math and the algorithms, say here's my new assortment of what is suggested and optimal, and it will give you the actual demand out of the new assortment based upon the technique. It's very interesting. Last thing I just want to point out is, obviously, every category is different. If you look at beer in the bottom right, what is important in beer for the attributes is going to be different than what's important in snack case. But let's take you through and try and understand the patterns as it goes through. So the first question is, can you see the patterns in this data? Mm-hmm. Along the left-hand side is a size. These are automobile tires. And along the top are price bands. Think of it, the best way to think is on the right are the cheaper, what is up here, which is fair, or the cheapest ones. The most expensive ones are over to the left, which is super superior. And the sizes, these are sizes that most of you probably see if you looked on the outside of your tires. It would say something like P55, R16, blah, blah, blah. Those are the sizes. But the key thing to look at here is, with just looking at that, can you pick out what the patterns are and what's going on inside of this category? And the answer is, even this is built off of thousands and thousands of different sales in a retailer to build what you see right here. Here's a hint. The first pattern that comes out is when there was a lower priced product available, demand shifted to it. So what you're going to notice is that there are certain of these areas where a low price product was not available in some of the larger sizes. A bit of this was retail strategy. I'm going to move off here so I can explain it a little bit better. Can you hear me? No. Try this one. If you look at the ones right here, there's a big black spot just below that 284. What that meant was that retailer chose not to offer a cheap tire. And part of their thinking and strategy was people will move to a higher priced tire. Makes logical sense. They were going to push them there. What they didn't know, without digging into the data, was a couple of things. How many people traded and how many people did not as it went through? And the other question, which is a question for perhaps another day, is how much money did they make on each of those types of tires? The first one we can measure. The substitution from fair to good is 60%. We can calculate it because we calculate the demand shares when it existed versus when it did not exist and how much demand went to each of these. And what it in essence said was, hey look, your raw demand of what you think you are selling for each of these If you look at good and you look at sales shares, it says 57.5%. If I'm thinking about my assortment, and that's my existing assortment, I think I've got a very strong business in good second level up price tier, all tires. I think I've got 57%. However, the reality is only 18% of the true demand is there when you pull it apart to attributes. 70% of the demand was in the lowest price tier. And even more important, of things moving from fair over to good, the low moving up there, was 60%. What that meant was 40% of the consumers didn't buy what they wanted. Where did they go? Well, some of them traded up, obviously, 60%. 40% of them went someplace else. They left. And the question you then have to ask is was that worth it? I chose to not offer those tires, and I lost X amount of sales. Algorithmically, you can even calculate that as to how much profit was lost and what's the better strategy. Key point in all of this is the following now. All right. For tires, these are the two most important attributes. It was price and size. That was it. The rest of the things didn't matter nearly as much. Second is when you pull apart the data and you start showing it to people, the patterns emerge of what is there. There's one other key point in this, which is sometimes there was not a tire available in one of those areas. So for instance, you see the white spot, which is best in a size A. The tire didn't exist. But it's pretty clear that there was in the marketplace demand for a tire like that. So the retailer ideally would go to the manufacturer and say, I'd like a tire this size within this price range. I've got demand for it. Here's what I need. So it is a way to look at new products as well. A lot of things come out of one analysis. I can determine, demand transference. I can determine what true demand is, not what I think it is with my assortment. And I can find new products as it goes in. And the last is I can optimize my assortment based upon what do they want. This set of analysis can actually be done down to store levels and clusters as it goes through. Find the pattern. Customer demand is based on these attributes. 2, create a model that explains the pattern. Certain stores have higher sales proportional for each of these attributes. It's what makes them unique, is the fact that you have more demand for certain tires. One of the interesting parts of this model was when run, we had 2 stores that were less than 5 miles apart, both in Puerto Rico, obviously before the hurricane. The difference was dramatic in terms of the higher end tires sold much better in one than the other. They were only 5 miles apart, but the customers were very different for those 2 different stores. So it's very interesting to look at when you look at it. And the next thing to think about is we have to find, even though we've got this technique, and this technique pulls it apart, shows you what's the correct application for this math and the science. It's assortment. Assortment is the perfect thing for this to say, what should I be doing? Also, we use this to monitor and change the assortment over time. Because over time, consumers change. What are their preferences changes over time. As before, learnings and conclusions. One technique. Take demand, pull it down to the attribute level. Optimized assortment has a pretty significant impact on sales. 3 to 6% increase. We're currently working with a retailer, a jewelry retailer in the United States. The numbers are actually slightly higher than that, 6% increase by doing optimized assortment. Same items as existing as today, no new products. Assortment offered distorts sales from true demand. In other words, part of the problem you have is when you create an assortment, it's always somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. What you sold looks like what you're going to sell tomorrow and the next day, unless you pull it down to these attributes. So it's important to understand that this is key. The next part, which we do advise, is to verify, not just looking backwards in time in data, but to match it up to the demographics. There have been many times we've been surprised. We thought, for instance, that in the Puerto Rico example, one store logically, and the buyer thought logically, the two stores were identical. And we looked at the demographic data, and it didn't really tell you much. What it told you was there was a slightly higher amount of income in one versus the other, but it did verify that that was one of the reasons is they had more money even though it was that close. Upper right, substitution. Substitution rates vary radically between products. Sometimes not as much as what you might think. Again, recent project we're working on, jewelry retailer, there's not as much substitution as we thought in between things, certain bracelets with different types of gold or jewels in them and so forth. We thought substitution would be quite high. It's not. It actually has more to do for them, price band. It's what I would call a gifting phenomena. If I'm going to give a gift, I predominantly care about the amount of money, not necessarily the thing. It's maybe an indictment against all males that walk into this store, is they don't care what it is as long as it costs a certain amount. But it was true. Substitution was not that much with those products. And this retailer is a high gifting type of a retailer. Last, localization. Value of localization varies quite a bit. And as we look at kind of this technique of attributes and demand and assortment and so forth, there's two things that you're really trying to drive at to understand. One is proliferation. When do I have way too many products to where they're all substituting for each other at a certain end? And the second is localization. How different is that local market than the next, and the next, and the next? And those two things both can be measured. What we found in many cases is there are a lot of retailers that should localize all the way down to an individual store. And there are others that should only have 2 to 3 clusters because it's not worth the incremental effort. And again, the math shows you exactly what is the correct amount as you go through each of those. All right. I'll give you just a back 40,000 foot view. First off, the good news for everybody in the room is a retail. Retailers have tremendous amounts of data and information. You as organizations are what I call a data production factory. Every single day, you've got things that are sold, item attributes, prices, the amount of information is absolutely amazing. That said, in order to take use of it requires techniques. Those techniques are data mining. Predictive analytics, machine learning, are the types of things that can look at all of this data and determine the patterns as it goes through. It sounds complicated, but the reality is it's not all that hard. All you're doing is you're running all of your information against these patterns, and it's kicking you out correlations, and you decide what that means for your business, and then act on it. Personalization is key. A lot of this information at these levels with data mining can get you much closer to either store localization or personalization as you go through. That said, an individual, and maybe I should relate back to the slide where I said find the pattern. Human beings aren't wired for this. We're not good at this. We're not good at looking at tons of information and finding the things that are right. These machines are great at it, but you have to then look at it and say, does it make sense? What can I use it for? And the last is what we call pitfalls. There's 2 types of learning that you can do with these techniques, supervised and unsupervised. Basically, the best way to explain it is, unsupervised says, just give it the data, all of the information you can, the algorithms go through and they tell you something about it. The other way to do it is to say, I have a theory. I think that my consumers buy more when they get this item for less. It's a theory that I have. Then you go back into the data and do it, and that's supervised learning. It goes out to see if it can find something to support what you think. It's fascinating because many retailers have their strategies of how they operate, and it's interesting to take the retail strategy, then look for it and to see if it actually exists in their sales data. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. This is the one I'm going to pass over quickly. For those of you who are advanced in statistics and methodologies and so forth, the key point on this one is there are lots of different algorithms, machine learning techniques that exist in the world, but not all of them work for all problems in retail. A quick example, K-means clustering as a technique works particularly good at finding out seasonality, at looking at fashion goods, looking at the sales, and determining exactly what's the right seasonality profile and curve for each one of those. However, you wouldn't go down to the third technique, which is called random forest, and use it. It wouldn't give you good answers. So you have to know which technique is going to give you the best answer. An example further down, like I said, random forest. This is an amazing piece of machine learning and technology that can look at all of your attributes, and it can, in effect, tell you what are the most important ones to the consumer based upon that category as it sells. We had a discussion earlier with coffee. The discussion was, and hopefully no one will disagree with what I'm about to say, a manufacturer like, or a producer like Coca-Cola may say, I think that your planograms and the way that you could lay out products should be by brand. This is the way to go as it goes through. If you use random forest, it's possible random forest could look at it and say, no. Flavor is the most important thing first, not brand. And we look through. So it's a technique to verify in data what the proposition is, but it gives you an answer. It tells you the correlation, tells you exactly what's going on. All of these are different techniques that we use, but we apply them specifically to different ways to either do things like price optimization, et cetera, as it goes through. Right. What would you learn through all of this? Now, first off, it takes good data. If you get bad data in, the learning is flawed. It looks through these kind of techniques, will come up with bad answers. The more history you have, the more you can look back in time, the better. The other point is the more causal factors you have. What do I mean by causal factors? Believe it or not, things like weather matter. So if you had a promotion at a certain point in time, if you had a competitor open up a store nearby, these are all causal factors that influence the data. The more causal factors, the better. You can do the analysis with none of it, but the more, the better, obviously. And the last part has to do a little bit with just the way that this machine learning works. Even if you have lots of data and lots of information and you apply it to it, you need to be careful. And I'll give you a couple of examples of things that we have found. The first one is what we call the $5 platinum brick. Machine learning looks at all of the data, and it comes up with a brilliant analysis. It says if you had a brick of platinum and you sold it for $5, you could sell a lot of that. Any logical person would say, there's no way, I can't produce it for $5. It's probably worth, several $1,000s. So the machine doesn't understand concepts like profitability, et cetera, and so you have to watch what it's producing and say, does that really make sense in the real world as you apply it? The second one is your data has to at least be good enough to be what we call normalized to a level. We have one retailer that we work with. They have chocolate spelled 5 different ways. Chocolate, chocolate with an E, CH, something with an A, all different ways of spelling chocolate. When the machine looks at it, to it, they look like 5 different things if it's spelled 5 different ways. It has to be normalized into one in order to make use of it. So again, the data is important. Can you clean it up? Yes, it's not hard, but you need to know when you look at your data, what you're looking at. The other one that we talked about, which is an interesting one, fashion. We had one it was looking at, it looked at the pattern, it said, wow, this is going to sell well. It's selling well in March, it's going to sell well the rest of the year. It had a small designation on it. It was a fashion t-shirt, and it had STP. It was St. Patrick's Day. It was a St. Patrick's Day t-shirt. The machine didn't know that. The machine looked at it and said, it's sold well in March, it can sell well the rest of the year. So you have to watch out and make sure that what is in the real world, that the machine translates it back. And the last one is just one on data itself. You need to have, as I pointed out in that pattern of all of the data that was up there, you need to have enough information so that you can start to pull out the patterns. Too little information leads to bad conclusions. That said, I'll almost guarantee you everybody in the room has more than enough information to use these techniques. Every single time we've seen it, the data of sales data, attributes, inventory information is more than enough to do it and analyze it and see what's going on. Last is just a little bit of, okay, what would you do? How would you get started with this? First off is ask the right questions. What kind of things do you think you would need to know more about your consumers? Second, if you can do it, get your data, get it normalized. If you're not retaining history on your information, storage is cheap these days, keep it. It will become valuable. You can find patterns in old data. Have a data science or an analytic resource. Now that said, I'd also point out you don't necessarily have to have them in-house. Part of what we have done, and working with our partners here in Brazil as well, we have data analysis people that we keep on staff, and they work with all of our retailers. Every single time data comes through, they do it. So either you can have somebody who's analytically inclined, or we can provide that person as part of the relationship that we work with people. And the last is obviously connect to the operational system. In terms of saying, okay, here's an ideal assortment, let's put this in. Here is an optimal price on a markdown pattern, put this in as it goes through. Finally, I want to just explain a little bit about, even though there's all this math and algorithms and so forth in the backdrop, what does it really mean from, how do you use it? Number one, we have the replenishment suite. So it's what's the right product at store level, store orders, back to distribution center and so forth. Second, allocation. If you have products that you wanted to distribute to which stores, what's the right amount to each of these stores. Assortment optimization, using those techniques to decide what's the clusters, what's the right amount of each of those. Markdown techniques, price elasticity and demand combined, so that you can look at how to optimize your profit. And then initial buy. When you have products you can only buy once per year, and you're done, what's the right amount? Obviously it's important because if you get the initial buy wrong, your allocation and your markdown have to do a lot of more work in order to make up for what was wrong with that. And the other thing that I just want to point out is the way that we work as an organization is we're big on data and information. And what we do with many retailers is we start talking, we say, I'll tell you what, just give us some information and we'll do an initial analysis and tell you what we see. Where's the profit? What's going on? Where does it look like it's a good business case? We do that for free. There is no charge. Most consultancies charge a lot of money for this. We happen to be a very different perspective organization. The way that we work with people is based upon your business improving. And so we want to be very much partners. We don't want to just sell you a piece of software. We have an ongoing relationship. We attach people, we pull information in, we optimize, and then we talk with you on a day in, day out basis. We don't want to just give you what's the ideal order point all of the time, what's your markdown price. We can certainly do that, but we want to analyze the business and say, how could you make more money? What's the patterns you're seeing? How can you improve your business overall? That is what gets us up in the morning and gets us excited about what we do as a business. Last, I just make the point. This seems a little bit kind of out there for most people, very futuristic to talk about machine learning, data science, etc. I would point out to you that the most profitable retailers out there are investing in these techniques today and leveraging the fact that you now have techniques with lots of information, with cheap computing, with cheap storage, that you can find these patterns and you can produce them and use them, and you can bypass, in many cases, a lot of the larger competitors that have a lot more information by using these kind of techniques. So with that, we'll be outside. We've got a couple of other folks with the organization. If you have additional questions, be glad to answer them. But thank you, and I hope if nothing else today, this made you think a little differently than you did when you walked into the room. So, thank you.